world where a select group of pastors, imams, rabbis, and other religious leaders preach hate from the pulpit every Sunday, and then their congregants have hate in their heart on a Monday when they interact with members of their community that are perceived to be sinners. It is undebatable that this hate affects and causes harm to them, and therefore, we say that just as private businesses whose employees practice discrimination are held accountable in courts, the religious institutions where congregants practice discrimination should face a standard of legal accountability. Therefore, we would allow individuals to sue religious institutions in their communities for propagating those beliefs that cause them significant harm. 3 points on this. First, that it empowers marginalized members of a community. Second, that it changes clergy-congregant relations. And third, that it increases a community's ability to engage in collective action. But before I go into my points, a little bit of a model. So what we're looking at here is that when a church is shown to be preaching something that then causes their members to go out into the community and be, for example, homophobic or sexist or say terrible things about women seeking abortion, just like general examples, we think that the individuals who have been the victim, the target of this hatred, have two options. If it's a non-violent type of discrimination, they can take the court to take the church or other religious institution to civil court for for damages. And if it's some sort of violent crime, like if gay bashing occurs, then we say that they can actually take the institution to a criminal court and hold them as an accessory to that crime. Okay, so.
Point of clarification.
Sure.
Could you define what significant harm means in today's round?
So I think significant harm has a lot of different forms. I think that that's partly going to be determined by the court in terms of like whether they decide to indict, whether they decide to move on and prosecute and hold the defendant guilty. But I think that some general examples could be like bullying that causes an LGBT to attempt suicide, or something like assaulting someone seeking an abortion on the sidewalk outside of a clinic. I think that these are all like perfectly good examples of extensive harm that already happened in the United States. Okay, moving on to my first point. First, that it empowers marginalized members of the community. So, we live in a society right now where there's a lot of municipal segregation happening, right? You see that LGBTQ people, people of color, generally tend towards cities, and then you see more conservative suburbs and rural areas. But unfortunately, not every LGBT person can just move to an area in which they will find social acceptance. We also think that that's like a fairly unfair standard to place on them, that they have to move away from their hometown, from a place that they feel some sort of connection towards, in order to find social acceptance. And we also see that even in cities, there's rampant discrimination within smaller, isolated communities. In societies where a church holds a particular sway over a community, and we see this particularly in small towns, where you see individuals going to one church, and that church serving as the hub of a social network that then affects community relations, we think that this creates a system that is very akin to state-sanctioned discrimination. For example, you see in small towns quite frequently that if individuals attend, for example, a homophobic church, they won't go and patronize LGBT-owned businesses. If an LGBT individual isn't welcome in that church, that means they're not going to potlucks, they're not going to these like social events, which means that those church events carry over into like secular society and cause greater social sanctions, which then creates this divide where they're more likely to experience bullying and other forms of really harmful social interactions. This creates damage in 3 ways. No. So first, we think it creates financial damage. The case that I just brought up too is like the perfect example where individuals don't patronize the business of someone that they perceive to be a sinner, and that person suffers severe repercussions. The second we see is that they face some sort of social repercussions, like bullying. And the third we see is that individuals often face some sort of physical harm when members of a church end up taking that belief to an extreme and end up committing assault or some other type of thing. We say that when it is a church that created this social schism, even if it didn't explicitly say to its members, go out and harm this group of people, that schism always results in some sort of harm, and when it reaches that threshold of severity, the church is therefore culpable in that harm. Social damage, basically, as I said, always causes some sort of harm, and the church is aware of these consequences in their community, which means that this speech ends up being akin to violence, even if you aren't directly saying, go out and commit a crime against this group. Individuals therefore have some right to recourse, whether it be punitive or in terms of reparations for the damages that they have incurred. No. And we say that the best way of getting that reparation is through the church. Second of all, my second point about how this changes clergy-congregant relations. But before that, does anyone have a POI? Nobody. Back up.
Are religions on your side of the wall allowed to say that some things are not allowed and some things are sin at all because those could cause significant harm and could make individuals in the community feel like others shouldn't be doing those things?
So I think there's a difference between saying that, for example, homosexuality is a sin, which I might personally disagree with, but is something that a church has a right to say, and saying everyone who is gay is a sinner. They are bad people. You shouldn't interact with them in your daily life because if you do, you are interacting with sinners and that sin will transfer to you. I think that there's a pretty clear difference between like these sort of moderate religious institutions that have like some sort of general standard for their members and like preaching hate in such an explicit manner. I don't think that we're just going to like create the system where every church has to adhere to like some sort of ridiculous standard. Second point about how this changes clergy-congregant relations. Recognize that a lot of churches are poor, which means that they will be scared of some sort of legal suit, and this will have like an effect on their behavior and a moderating message. But in the cases that churches are rich and powerful, and that so it wouldn't have a huge effect on the fact that like they're able to be financially solvent, we think that suing has two effects. First, it shows them that they're not immune to public scrutiny. And second of all, we say that even if it's not ruinous, because those smaller churches will be affected, because those like really extreme Westboro Baptist cases will end up having to close in some situations, we say that the churches will be trying to attract more congregants from the smaller churches that can no longer stay afloat, which means they have, first of all, more eyes on them and a higher standard of public scrutiny, but second of all, that they need to preach a more moderating message to attract those members of the society that are now churchless. We think that that's going to end up creating a change in clergy messages where you end up getting more tolerance in society. And the final point about how this increases the ability to engage in collective action, it's like pretty simple. If you have less of a community divide and you have some sort of issue in a community like racial discrimination or economic disenfranchisement, members of the community are more likely to band together when they don't hate each other. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you, and I invite the leader of opposition.
All good?
Yeah.
What are we comfortable with on side opposition? We are comfortable with bringing charges against religious organizations when there are clear examples of incitement. That is to say, if a religious organization says, go, you see those Muslims there, we are going to kill them. That is, we are perfectly comfortable with bringing charges with those instances. Secondly, we are comfortable bringing criminal charges against individuals that directly perpetrate harms. That is, if you can show that the Catholic Church was literally being discriminatory or did something like, for example, like the child sex abuse scandal, we are happy seeing charges in those instances. Thirdly, we are happy to see defendants bring civil charges, or people bring civil charges against someone who, for example, did the bullying. That is to say, maybe a church propagated beliefs that pushed someone to do that. You can still bring a tort lawsuit against the person that actually perpetrated the harm against you. What they needed to defend on their side was merely bringing a lawsuit against an organization for the fact that they chose to exercise their speech and chose to propagate certain beliefs in society. I don't think that we got a meaningful case for that. Three things in the speech. First of all, the principle, why we think that this exists outside the scope of tort law. Secondly, why we think that they're going to likely make these harmful beliefs get worse and entrench them within the religious organizations that are being sued. And lastly, why this is going to criminalize minority status for religious minorities. So first on tort law, what do we say? We say that the tort system exists so that unreasonable actions that are done to people that cause harm can deserve compensation. There are three reasons why we think that this doesn't exist within the scope of tort law. First of all, we tell you religion is special and holds a special status within the state. Religious beliefs are deeply ingrained beliefs which people literally believe are the word of God, and furthermore there's been a long history of state interference and discrimination within religious organizations. Thus we give these organizations special protection from the coercive power of the state. We say that they don't have to pay taxes. We say that they can avoid certain aspects of the law. What we say is that individuals don't choose their set of beliefs meaningfully when they are born into religions, and thus it is unjust to say simply because you were raised in an organization that told you homophobia was good, that you ought to be sued merely for exercising that belief. Secondly, we say that these harms are subjective and controversial. Like, literally, how the fuck do you determine what the compensation for the church saying that homophobia is a sin is? What is the level of harm that that causes to an individual? How could you ever prove that that is the tipping point upon which now an individual goes out and chooses to commit a crime? These are things that are literally impossible to prove within the court of law. Thirdly, I think this sets a horrifying precedent. The stance that we get from opening government is literally saying that something like just expressing racism through speech is something that is a harm and you ought to be able to sue for it. The logical extent of that is that people ought to be able to sue anytime an individual expresses a belief that is homophobic, anytime an individual says that abortion is bad. That is literally an unreasonable standard. Tort law exists to ensure that actions that cause a direct and obvious and explicit harm, like me running over Dennis with a car, those are the kinds of things that you can sue for in the court of law. This is literally absurd. Second thing, no. Harmful beliefs get worse. Honestly, there is a long history of states trying to stamp out beliefs that they viewed were harmful in religious organizations. It has never worked. Why? Because if it is true that people don't consent into these beliefs in an ordinary way, if people believe things that they learn in church or learn in their mosque and believe that it is the word of God, the state bringing a lawsuit against that organization is never going to persuade these people that their belief is invalid. If anything, it often justifies it, right? The same way that when the Romans chose to massacre Christians because they believed that their beliefs were horribly unjust, it merely fueled the fire of Christianity. We see these kinds of things happen all the time, like in Catholic Europe when Protestantism was attempted to be stamped out. So what happens? First of all, people's beliefs don't change because state condemnation is never enough to do that. Secondly, you turn these people into martyrs. When you have extreme imams or extreme clergy that are now put on trial or are now brought into courts of law, what you see is an entrenchment of these views because people grow more absolutist and these people become martyrs for the cause. Thirdly, you delegitimize martyr groups. How does change actually happen in religions? It happens internally. It happens because you see people like Pope Francis come to the front of the Catholic Church and start to change views that happen. But on their side of the house, these groups are delegitimized because they are viewed as having the same ideas as those that are oppressing your religion, and thus those people can never come to the forefront of the faith and ever change it from the inside. The impact is that if you believe that the pragmatic advocacy of opening government is how they could possibly ever win the round, then what we do is we merely turn the impact and we show you that the harmful beliefs that they are talking about get worse. You get even more anti-abortion rhetoric coming out of the Catholic Church because these organizations are not merely institutions, they are ideologies and they are beliefs, and you cannot stamp them out merely in the court of law. Last thing I want to talk about is criminalization of minority status, but I'll take back half before that.
Yeah, so you were talking about how these are not fundamentally torts and they can't be punished through tort law. We recognize that the state can punish things like intentional infliction of emotional distress through torts. How is this different?
Here. I think it's foundationally different. The first reason is because, like I said, we are happy to see individuals that do something that is horribly unjust be sued. But secondly, because this is merely speech. That is to say, if I were to go out and talk about how, for example, I was racist, right, it would just be an unreasonable standard to allow people to sue and allow the state's coercive force to be used against those individuals purely for the exercise of that speech. There's no way that we can objectively determine which beliefs or which are good and bad in every instance, and we don't think it is right to allow the state to be able to make that determination. It is an unreasonable standard. Last thing, criminalization of minority status. What do we say? Who is likely to win these cases and who is likely to lose these cases? What we say is big organizations and big institutions are far more likely to win. Why? Because when you look at an organization like the Catholic Church, they have massive resources with which to get lots and lots of great lawyers. They are deeply tied to the community. Like, you ever really think a court in Boston is going to be able, people are going to be able to successfully sue in Boston to say that the Catholic Church promoted abortion? It is literally absurd. Everyone within that community is often a part of that faith or knows people who are part of that faith and believe that these views are at least reasonable and not a harm. Thirdly, it is impossible to prove that widely held beliefs are sufficiently harmful to warrant compensation. So what happens? The only organizations that ever lose these court cases on their side of the house are religious minorities. Things like small groups of people that are not necessarily popular or populous within that state. What is the impact here? These groups are often mapped onto ethnic and racial lines. So I think what you end up seeing on their side of the house is massive lawsuits that stamp out the ability of institutions that form the basis of community communities in places like in the developing world, or even honestly in lots of cities in America that have formed the very core of these communities, what you see is a massive form of discrimination against these communities that drain the resources by which people are often educated through religious schools. People often find their communities and meet people through religious schools. They find other people who they can have solidarity with because they've experienced discrimination. And when these institutions are stamped out and lose resources and face state condemnation, the impact is that this is disastrous for the people's lives who exist within these minority groups. They must grapple with the reality of who actually win these lawsuits. Maybe the DPM will do better. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister. You can just speak from the table if you want.
I think I'll actually be fine. But thanks.
Oh, sorry, can I have my passes?
Oh, yeah, sure. Grab all the things right down. Everyone ready? Cool. What the last speech didn't engage with is how we're going to cause religious reform on an institutional level. That is, we're going to make religions less harmful writ large. This is going to outweigh any of the marginal impacts they give you, how certain individual churches are going to fall. Right? With that, we're going to encourage reform. A few reasons. Recognize that in the status quo, religious institutions get away with preaching hate from the pulpit because they're not accountable for the social harms that their beliefs entail. When a church preaches that black people are not really children of God, like the Mormons did until 1973, or when they preach an idea, for example, the Christian and Muslim sects in the status quo, that gay people are less than people, that is, they are subhuman, this creates the humongous harms to the oppressed individuals in these societies. And notably, it affects the entire society, not just some subset of individuals within it, because it affects the entire way in which individuals think about how oppressed people are, right? These beliefs affect societal treatment of marginalized groups. We, on our side, uniquely change the structure of how these beliefs manifest themselves in society. This is going to outweigh any of the analysis we get from OO. So first, recognize and provide an incentive for churches and more religious institutions generally to be more tolerant insofar as their preachments can now be the source of liability when they preach lessons that are no longer going to be as hurtful. That is, insofar as they are now accountable for the preachments they believe, we think it's significantly more likely they're going to preach less harmful things because they believe when they preach harmful things, it means that they are liable for that. In the same way, and the analogy that we give you for how companies are responsible when their employees do harmful things under their guidance. But second under this is that we think this changes how very religious people interact with others in society. Even if people still retain their harmful beliefs, they're now less likely to explicitly act upon those beliefs because they know that doing so affects both themselves and their religious institution. That is, when individuals go out and engage with others in society, now they recognize that when they're responsible, that not only are they responsible for how they act, but the people they engage with on a weekly or daily basis, that is, the people they care about in their church, are now going to be more responsible also. Insofar as we now give an additional reason why people aren't going to act poorly towards other people, because now it affects them and their church, this is an additional reason why we think there's more of an incentive not to act more poorly. But third, and most importantly, we think this means that religious institutions are less likely to condone violence on our side of the house. Recognize that in the status quo, there's a humongous amount of violence condoned by religious institutions, both explicitly and in a wishy-washy manner that says, oh, well, maybe it will be permissible if some amounts of religious terror and violence are justified. We're not going to take a stance on it. Insofar as that's true, there's a lot of violence on their side of the house that we're going to prevent, right? In our world, religious institutions can get away with blaming specific individuals who act in accordance with their religious beliefs as being separate from the church, and they try to separate themselves from it. But in our world, religious institutions are significantly less likely to have these wishy-washy positions of religious violence, like we see in the Muslim world in the status quo, when there are debates about whether it's permissible to bomb the West, right? Only our side of the house makes sure that people in religious preachments are going to be less violent and are going to have a significantly more amount of accountability. We think that's better on our side, right? Furthermore, recognize that there are entire societies where religious institutions hold sway over the entire community. Think about Rwanda, right? The persecution of Hutus was preached from the pulpit of Catholic churches for decades. And what do we see? And furthermore, it was preached from religiously owned radio stations in those communities, right? Do you think that had some say and had some effect on the fact that 800,000 people were committed genocide against by a community of entire entirely religious individuals, right? Recognize that this was a religious preachment, and that on their side of the house, the Catholic Church, not only are they not responsible for it, they haven't even apologized for it, because they're not accountable for it at all. On our side of the house, we have significant means by which we can hold these institutions accountable and create more public discourse, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. On their side of the house, they have no way of engaging with the fact that people are people are having their most basic individual rights violated with no recourse. We provide recourse for victims. That's not the point of the debate. They really miss out on. I'm going to weigh on that again in a little bit. So, but what do we hear from OO? Right? First, they give this principled argument about, this isn't how tort laws work. Recognize this argument is silly and it shouldn't hold any sway in the debate. First, there's a difference between a descriptive claim and a prescriptive claim, right? There's a difference between, if you're gay, that's bad, and gay people are horrible individuals, or Hutus are horrible individuals, and you should murder them, right? Insofar as that's true, we think there's clearly a fundamental difference here. And they try to sidestep this by saying that, when churches explicitly condone violence, right, they're going to be prosecuted in their side of the house. Recognize that first, they concede to the entire principle that we're telling you, which is that churches are responsible for the actions of their members when churches preach things that are harmful. Right? There's literally no difference what they're advocating for and what we're saying on our side of the house, because if they're going to accept that when churches preach harmful messages, their members can be responsible for them, our side of the house says that that's correct, because churches are institutions which have sway over the actions of their members, and therefore they're responsible for the harm that occurs. They're literally, by conceding that in the first 5 seconds of his speech, he's conceded the entire round for his side. He's conceding to the principle that we give you out of OG. But second, he says that, these claims are subjective, so that it can't be evaluated in tort law, right? Recognize that there's already compensation for things that are subjective in tort law, right? It's a very wishy-washy interpretation of how tort law actually works. We already have laws, for example, against hate crimes, because hate crimes are committed by people who have horrible intentions for their actions, right? We think that this is permissible in our side of the house. And third, he says that they're going to be able to sue any horrible person. But recognize that what they're doing on their side of the house is valuing the rights of the religious minority more than the rights of other minorities who are persecuted by religious people. And so far as that's true, we don't see any reason for this trade-off. We think they're going to cause significantly more social harm, results in more harmful institutional norms on their side. What is the second thing he says? He thinks the harms are going to get worse, right? But what he fails to engage with, and what is really important on our side, is that religious institutions writ large are more tolerant. First, we tell you that we're going to change how the clergy preach. We give an explicit mechanism by which, because the clergymen know that their beliefs can be, that the beliefs they preach can be used against them and used against their churches, means they're going to be preaching less hate in the first place. And second of all, and this is really important, and they don't engage with this at all, is that those extremist groups that they talk about, like the individuals that are left over, are going to be pushed into more moderate institutions once their extremist institutions go away. That is, the Westboro Baptist Church example that I gave you in the last speech is a whole bunch of hateful extremists, and if you shut their church down, they're going to go into other forms they're going to go into other churches, which are going to make them more tolerant, because as we said before, these churches are going to be preaching more tolerant messages on our side. We think this is better for the world at large. Furthermore, we think it's better for the individuals that are actually persecuted by these religious institutions, insofar as these people not only means of recompense, and it means we can hold institutions to a higher level of accountability, because even when these suits are brought, even if they don't win, as I tell you on their side, even if they don't win these lawsuits, there's now a larger amount of public accountability. That is, people see these lawsuits going to take place, and therefore think that there's a reason to question these institutions that they would otherwise have no reason to question, and they also think that these institutions are no longer have the moral high ground to persecute ethnic and religious minorities. We think this is good for the world. We're proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you. To close the opening half, I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
This is really small. You were right. I can do it.
Anyone is more than welcome to speak from that big table. I really don't care.
Like the podium. Is everyone ready? I think OG lost the ground and they ran away from it. What does the PM tell you that loses them automatically? What they say is, it's okay to say that being gay is a sin, but the problem is when you say don't hang out with sinners. I just don't understand. She asserts that the distinction is clear, but quite frankly, I just don't see it. Every time they talk about incitement, they talk about, literally brings up the Hutus and says that, when they said it was about, saying that you should commit a genocide, that's their scope. What? That's literally the incitement that Robbie tells you we're already fine with suing with. This case is specifically about when the
preaching of the ideology itself is the problem, right? All the other actions that follow from it are not the debate. There are 4 things I want to cover in this speech. 1, why the state is uniquely the wrong actor for change. 2, even in their world, who sues and who wins and who is oppressed. 3, who actually changes religion? Because outside of OG saying they're afraid of being sued, they don't really give you a mechanism. You can't just say that word and assert that they're going to change things. And 4th and finally, responding to the CGPOI, how is this uniquely different from emotional damages and how do we already solve for this? I think it's like 2 seconds, right? You can already sue the individual for bullying. So, why is the state the wrong actor for change? 2 things. First, perverse incentives. Let's be very clear. The state wants to maintain power. Nationalism and patriotism in countries like China literally controls and restricts the autonomy of people. Religion is a unique institution in these places because it gives you another framework by which you can act and another source of authority that you should listen to. What happens on their side of the house? We think it's very likely that the Chinese Supreme Court will always rule in favor of people that say that the Uyghurs who live in the northwest region of China are preaching hateful things and that they should go to jail. That the Falun Gong, who are literally just trying to tell you how to meditate, are trying to brainwash their kids away from loving China and that they should be put into jails. This is the kind of speech that will be determined harmful on their side of the house because they can never deal with the subjectivity that Robbie tells you about what is and isn't hateful speech. No, I'll take you at the end of this. Secondly, the tort law thing, they laugh at this, but I think that the legal institution isn't just a place where I can get mad at other people, right? It is a place where harms that can be calculated and then redress can be distributed. I think these are 2 reasons why that there are really perverse incentives that the state shouldn't be the ones dealing with this. Go, OG, POI.
Why should the rights of a religious minority take precedence over the rights of some other kind of minority?
What? This isn't about rights claims, Madam Speaker. This is about what is the state the right actor to do this, right? Also, oftentimes the religious minorities run along these lines. Recognize that the Christian church during the 1960s and the civil rights movement was a huge, Dr. Martin Luther King was a preacher, right? A lot of the civil rights movement was birthed in these places. I think they could just come up here and say, those are the kinds of groups that we need to be suing because I don't agree with the kind of speech that they have, right? I just don't understand why they're conflating these things. The second thing I want to ask is, who sues and who wins? We think that when large groups sue small groups, this looks like the Catholic Church responding to more liberal churches that preach things like, being homophobic is imagine a small church was preaching that being homophobic is a sin. To myself, as a Catholic, I would feel that this attacks who I am as a human. When they say that I'm going to hell because of my homophobia, on their side of the house, the Catholic Church would have the right to sue these smaller churches because they'd be suffering the same kind of emotional damages here, right? We think those are the kinds of groups that sue. 2, the kinds of hate groups that hate churches that run along ethnic lines will just sue them for these same reasons that large groups will sue them, right? They just want to exterminate them and push them out. I think these are the kinds of lawsuits that you see on their side of the house. It's these groups that, and then the problem is that it's these groups that meaningfully change things, right? These smaller groups that act within the larger religion umbrella and push religions to the middle. The third thing, and I think the thing that most directly clashes with the advocacy of OG is who changes religion? Because at the point where they don't have the ability to do this, they're losing the round. There are 5 reasons why when you sue the Catholic Church, it doesn't do anything, or the Westboro Baptist Church. 1, radicalization and the rally around the flag effect. Look, the Catholic Church isn't looking to pivot towards moderates. It's looking to pivot right now towards getting more people who are the kids of Catholic kids, the kids of Catholic people, and things like this. Right? This is who they're looking towards. So this is the kind of radicalization that will happen. 2, I think that more people are going to move underground or radicalize more. They think that people in the Westboro Baptist Church suddenly join the most liberal church after it disappears. I don't think this is the case. I think they just meet in their basement and keep doing what they're going to do anyway, or they're just going to create a new church under a new framework and preach the same shit. I don't know how you can just assert they're going to go to a new liberal church. No. 3, I think you move moderates away. Look, moderates right now are the actual path to victory for opening opposition because they actually are the ones who are trying to move the church. But when they feel like they're under attack because they are attacked for their Catholicism, when you sue the church that they go to, this makes it so that they can no longer try to move into the church because you are all now radicalized against the people that are suing you. So those moderates stop trying to moderate. 4, I just don't think it is the case that when you sue a church that's going to make them want to change. Literally martyrdom is key to a lot of these churches. Literally Christians were willing to die in the Roman Colosseums before they renounced Jesus. I just don't understand why it is that they're going to renounce foundational beliefs of their religion because you sue them, right? If you think that suing is going to change more than discourse within the religion, then you just have a complete misunderstanding of how religion works. But 5th and finally, and this leads into the last question, I don't think they're going to win these
cases, right? So this leads to the fourth and final thing in this speech. Now, how is this uniquely different from emotional damage? This is going to deal with CG. I think there's a couple of things under this. One, you can sue the individual when there is direct culpability. Anytime someone does something like murder someone in the name of God, that person gets to go to jail. Being religious is not an excuse to not go to jail. This is intuitive, but clearly not intuitive enough for the government bench. Secondly, we think that in the court of law, you have to be able to prove some kind of causal direct link. I am perplexed by when they tell you that one of the ways that they're going to achieve solvency is by calculating lost sales. Like, are they just going to hire McKinsey to calculate who isn't coming to our church and why is the reason they're not coming to church? Because they don't want to buy from my cake shop or because of what the church said. This is the only reasonable example they give you that falls within the round, right? I just don't understand how they'll calculate this because that's not the goddamn role of the court system. It's to it's like the two things you can calculate. But third and finally, I think this responds to the third and finally, I think the subjectivity of what is emotional harm here is really important, right? This kind of ties back into the rest of my arguments, but the thing here is that at the point where I individually say that I feel that a huge injustice was done to me, but I don't have any kind of proof to it, right? I just say I feel this kind of thing. You could literally say that about anything, right? Which means that sure, they try to tell you that it's going to be people who feel oppressed, but unless you believe that the courts in all of these places are largely liberal and will lean to those intuitions and vote on that as something that counts as legitimate harm, but other kinds of emotional harm don't, then they won't be winning the round here, right? Because that distinction only exists in a philosophical sphere, but not in a legal one. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you. I now invite the government member.
Pursuant to the briefing, this is a round that takes place in Western democratic societies. In these societies, religion is dying. Secularization is on the rise as people move away from their churches, as people move away from the traditional institutions in which they were inculcated. And we think even outside of Western liberal societies, even outside of democratic societies, even outside of functional societies, religious institutions are weakening. We think that religion is a good thing, and we think that this policy revitalizes religion and saves it from the terminal decline that would otherwise prevent it from bringing so many benefits to people and to societies. 3 steps to this argument with rebuttal along the way. First, we're going to talk about the benefits of religion and do some framing as to how that's going to be the most important issue in this round. Second, we're going to talk about why this actually changes religious practice and doctrine beyond the simplistic analysis from opening government about not preaching violence, which is probably covered by other laws or other things that you literally can't incite violence. And third, we're going to talk about the concrete ways in which religious doctrine and practice changes and why that revitalizes religion in helpful ways. Let's start. What are the benefits of religion? Broadly speaking, we think they are threefold. First, solace. The experience of grace and the experience of divine presence provides a reprieve from the challenges and struggles that all people face in their lives. This is true for everyone, but particularly for marginalized people. It empowers them to fight against oppressive systems and is why the civil rights movement had such a religious tinge, as OO identifies. Second, guidance. Without religion, people are trapped in self-interest. Religion provides one of the overarching moral systems for most people who can't read or understand Kant that allows them to act in ways that are morally altruistic and that care concern for their fellow people because there is a higher court of appeal that is not just their self-interest but is the divine command. Third, community. In these societies, loneliness is an epidemic, and religion provides a binding glue which brings people together into societies. So look, I think that if we can prove to you that we revitalize religion and arrest its terminal decline, it allows the state to use religion to shape a cohesive political community, co-opting the benefits of OG. And I think that if we want to get arguments from OO about the rights of religion, including minority religions, we provide those rights and arrest their terminal decline. I think that's why this is the most important impact in the round. Also, if it allows marginalized people to fight for their rights, if religion does that, we think that that's a very important impact for the things that we get to talk about marginalization. Okay, so second, why does this actually change religious practice? 2 reasons here. Money. The systematic analysis here that was missing from our top half is that churches rely on voluntary contributions and church attendance is inconsistent and declining. That means that they don't have a consistent revenue base. But the second and more important reason is perception. In these societies, the advent of non-denominationalism and the fact that there are many options to choose from means churches and religious institutions are a very competitive market. That means that there's an enormous deterrent effect because you can choose which church to go to, and it will be incumbent upon churches, even if they are not sued, and even if OO is correct, if they don't actually lose these suits, they will still be deterred to prevent people coming forward and suing them. What does that actually mean? How does religion change? What are the concrete changes beyond OG telling us that churches will be more accountable? We think there are 3. First, religions will be less prescriptive. They will allow individuals more say in their relationship with God because they are less likely to be sued. I'm sorry, but you didn't say this. They are less likely to be sued when they give individuals more autonomy in shaping a relationship with the divine that is more in accordance with how they think, with the experiences that they have of transcendence and the experiences that they have of life. Note, OO says that the reason this won't change religious behavior is because it is a challenge to their fundamental beliefs. But it isn't. It's a question of emphasis, to emphasize divine mercy over divine rules, which is a change that churches can make and churches have made, and we push them in that direction. We think that that strengthens religion because it allows more people to have a relationship with the divine. It's easier to access that relationship. That relationship is phenomenologically similar to the things that you care about, and you perceive God as being more of a presence in your life. It is a higher order relationship, and it is more meaningful to people, and that brings people back to the church and arrests what otherwise would be a terminal decline of religion. Yeah, sure.
You are correct that it is a question of emphasis, but the problem is that moderates within these organizations are the ones that are trying to change the emphasis. Their views now become conflated with the views of people that are suing the church who are antagonized, thus delegitimizing moderates within these churches. Respond to our argument.
Yeah, I'll get to your point about arguments in my second concrete way that religion changes, which is that religion becomes less political. Look, we think that the types of preaching that people are likely to sue over are likely to be political preaching. Those are the types of preachings that interact and intersect directly with people's lives in ways that they can present a credible case, demonstrating causal evidence, as OO says that they will have to do, that they have been concretely harmed. This means that these churches focus more on things like altruism, on things like charity, on things like divine mercy and divine love, over restrictive political teachings. And we think that's really important for the moderates that OO wants to empower in these religions. Because the reason that moderates are being driven away from churches and from religious institutions by and large is because they disagree with their political posturing, right? Moderate or liberal American Catholics have been driven away from the Catholic Church because they perceive it as conservative. American Jews have been driven away from their synagogues because they perceive them as being too close to Israel. By making the church more able to accommodate different political identities, you bring people, including the moderates that they want to talk about, but you simply bring more people into those churches. You make them more robust communities, more accepting and more tolerant communities. Third, we think you make religious institutions less literalist. To be more open and less political, they need to move away from literalistic scripture. We think that literalistic scripture is untenable in a modern secular age and is one of the core reasons that religious attendance and religious congregations are declining. So look, we've given you the 3 core ways religions change. They become less prescriptive, they become less political, and they become less literalist. I want to talk about what we get from OO on how religions change. First, they say minority religions. So first, I think Falun Gong probably has a hard time under either side. In societies with functioning judiciary systems, like we have jurisprudence about peyote rights, it seems like we'll do this pretty reasonably. Second, we think that the mechanism, this encourages people from dominant churches to also fight for the rights of people from smaller churches and provides a mechanism to also go after and also deter big churches, so it evens the playing field between minority religions and other religions. It also helps to revitalize minority religions too. We think that's important. Finally, they say radicalization. They say churches go underground, maybe, but it's hard to run a church underground in the long term. You need followers. And they say martyrdom. But martyrdom is unlikely a notion that appeals to people in the modern age, that appeals to more increasingly secularized societies. That's not how churches compete. How they compete when they are deterred is by being less literalist, by being less prescriptive, and by being less political. That saves religion and thereby saves society. And as religious people, we are very proud to propose. As Gabe
Thank you. I now invite the opposition member.
Funny picture that's existed in this debate throughout, right? The idea of one dominant church and then just minorities under it and the interplay between those. We're going to shatter that image and talk about the real world where this debate actually plays into, right? Because remember that this is not just set in an abstract religious nation, but in particular communities. In communities that have different religions enclavized into them, with one area having a Hindu population and another area having a Muslim population within the same community, right? Local regions having these kinds of divides. We're going to talk to you about how those interplays actually manifest in the lives of a daily person there. And we're going to tell you how they make it hellish on government bench. But before that, a few layers of extraneous rebuttal to the member of government, right? So they say, essentially they give you a few reasons that OG already gave you, but impacted out saying that religions become less prescriptive and less literalist, right? Let's have 4 responses to this. First, to a religion, lost to the law weakens their claim of superiority over the state. The popular perception of religion is not of being legal, but of being above the law. And that's what religions aim to maintain. Second, money actually increases when you fight the law. Why? Not just because of you can play a victim card like O already tells you, but because if you fight and beat religion, that is your ultimate claim to fame, right? Because always there is money in religion for fundamentalism and for extremism, because there are certain individuals who have the money and prescribe to those beliefs, who valorize these particular churches and give directly to them the more they get involved in such disputes. So the more you get sued, the more money you get. So actually what they're doing is radicalizing churches. But third, that religious institutions don't change, right? Because for the people in those institutions, a legal penalty is less important than divine punishment. They would rather go to jail than go to hell at the end of their lives. But fourthly, right, the people who actually have the power to change religions aren't common people in them. They are priests, they are Catholic bishops who come from a different age and a different set of thought, who don't adhere to the same kinds of conceptions of law and of discourse. What actually happens then is that in their paranoia, in their grasp of power, what they actually do is to tighten their communities, become more exclusive, and hold on to the ability to discriminate. So if anything, they make their churches even more right-wing and entrench that power, as opposed to on our side, in the least, right, with time things evolve. But let's look at the debate overall so far, right? Opening government says churches are racist. So let's publicize and magnify that racism. Literally, right? The Patriarchal Mosque is right now being racist in their corner of Belgium. OG's response is, let's put it on every TV, every newspapers for every homophobe and LGBT person across the world to read and learn what the church said. And learn from the emotional rhetoric of those priests that apparently incite violence. Their solution to that is to magnify the problem. But these churches seek exactly this, right? To be infamous. And for the most part, they just wanted to argue against incitement of violence. Like O does one thing well, which is set up the debate, and we think incitement of violence is not what this debate is about. Let's talk about O then. They at least would have picked up the actual principle from our POI. Instead, they give us an inordinate amount of legal theory. But sure, let's hold on to that. What they want to say is a very simplistic conception of what communities look like. They say bad churches get stronger, big churches will always win. Why are we going to take this debate from CO? We're going to give you clarity in 2 pieces. First, we're going to clarify what the reality of legal suits and tort law looks like. We asked them in a POI to first speaker, right, at the end of their model, what does significant belief mean? They say that the courts decide, right? Literally, let's look at the literal words. They say saying homosexuality is a sin is okay, but saying gay people are all sinners is not okay. This kind of vagueness isn't just a problem because it is intrinsically again vague, but because anything will be sued. The nature of suits is that you don't need a winning case to run, as we learned from opening government today. The nature of suits on their side of the world is that the people with money and the people with the numbers will always keep suing, because as opening government themselves tell you, it is ruinous to face the suit. You have to pay billions, okay, not not billions, but thousands of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. You have to go to court and have personnel who go to court, which is in and of itself going to deprive you from the ability to maintain and have your religion persevere. But second, right, let's move out of the esoteric one church, one community concept and talk about the overwhelming majority of religious communities. Two extensions then in Turkey. First, let's talk about interfaith tensions. They run away from the diversity of countries. The diversity of countries is often a history of literal war between religions, be it between the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, with the followers of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe, between Jews in Poland, who are still a legal persecuted minority, now facing the plight of neo-Nazis, Protestants in Northern Ireland or Bosnia, and the kinds of intersection between ethnicity and religion, right? But literally, we've seen in places like India, where at the end of the Babri Masjid ruling, where the piece of land was allotted to one community of Hindus over the community of Muslims, it literally magnified the thousands of deaths in the form of riots. So what actually happens on government side is that the suit badgering becomes a race to the bottom, wherein you sue on behalf of your community. That is, the church or the mosque or the Hindu temple funds an individual in that community to sue the local church on their behalf. It becomes an interfaith tension taken to court. What is the immense harm that is born out of this? I'll take in a second. One, that this becomes a fight for everyone as opposed to a private dispute. It becomes a sectarian issue for the entire nation at the point which it becomes more vocal, obtains more ardent. Everyone feels possessiveness over the issue when they fight with their peers that this is the right thing, right? But second, right, the OG model is to take priests to court. They want to put pictures of priests being dragged in chains and taken to court on every television screen. What this looks like is three impacts. One, literal rise in many parts of the world where tensions between individuals result in violence. The same incitement of violence that they didn't want, but sure, okay.
Sure. We tell you that religious institutions have a much larger incentive to condemn violence on our side of the house due to the fear of liability. How do you reduce violence like we saw in the Rwandan genocide on your side of the house? How do you reduce
I already gave you 4 reasons why this doesn't happen. Actual violence comes from the followers of religion who are radicalized when it becomes a personal fight for everyone in the nation. But second, it creates more exclusive communities when you have an incentive to ensure that only Muslims live in the community of the mosque and only Christians live in the community of the church. It creates that interplay. But second, let's talk about minorities, right? 2 reasons why they make it worse for minorities. First, that it's harder to prosecute in court. Courts already have the incentive of public pressure from one overwhelming majority religion, of the trial by media which tells you always to rule in favor of church, of juries and judges who are already Catholic in and of themselves. What happens on opening governments and closing governments' house is that every time you go to court and prosecute for hate speech, prosecute for incitement of violence, and actually try to protect minorities in the worst cases of religious discrimination, the court gives you a simple prescription. This is a private matter which needs to be sued. And you will never win that suit because, like opening opposition tells you, you don't have the money or the numbers to do that. This is an important piece of analysis because private disputes is the norm that becomes on their side of the house. But second, right, progressive churches are badgered and get sued. At the point which they agree that it's ruinous to these churches, the little religious access of LGBT individuals or of minority individuals gets devastated. This is automatically then the more important extension than the opening conception of minorities we take this debate.
And thank you, and to close the government bench, I invite the government whip.
While I'm on this, like, I have more space. Oh, wow.
There are 2 questions in this room. Firstly, why must the state allow these suits? And secondly, how does religious practice change? Though we think the second question is more important, I'm going to talk about the first one first. So why must the state allow these suits? We think that the state must have political cohesion in order to exist as a functional entity. A lot of the analysis in this debate is about things like torts. It's about things like why it might be unjustified for the state to do these kinds of suits. But I think that this misses the clear analysis that in order for the state to exist, in order for the state to do things like protect rights, in order for the state to do things like enable people to pursue their own religious ends, it must first be a place where people feel as though they can coexist, where people respect each other, where people feel as though it is not legitimate for them to try to impose their beliefs upon others. What does opening opposition tell us? They tell us that this doesn't meet the standard of the tort. So let's be very clear. First of all, I think that it's the case that torts are going to be unclear, they're going to be ambiguous, but the comparison is that it is certain that you allow a harm to happen and someone can get away with it, or you create a chance where the person who the harm was done to can win out. So I think that even if it's uncertain, you prefer a world where you can avoid that great damage of the state validating a wrong that someone does to someone else. But they also tell us that they also tell us that these torts are just unacceptable to use because it's going to be unclear. We think that it's the case. The courts are always able to find evidence. They are fact finders. They have the ability to bring witnesses. I think they can do a pretty reasonable job of figuring out if the harm did accrue. Another thing that we hear in this round has to do with, from closing and opening, about the ways that minorities are hurt, and that maybe the state has some sort of obligation to protect minorities. So we have responses as to why minorities are better off in the long run, which I'm going to get into deeper into this speech. But I just want to be very clear that insofar as there are arguments about the ways that minorities are harmed, these mostly come down in opening opposition to the ways that, I'm not going to take it right now, to the ways that larger organizations win these suits, that smaller organizations might be more targeted. So most importantly, recognize that the deterrence effect is the main pathway by which we avoid these kinds of harms. We think that deterrence happens equally, and that deterrence means that large and small churches, majorities and minorities, are equally going to not face these harms. Why is this the case? Because no matter the size of your church, which opening government talks about, you face the same kinds of harms. You face costs. Even if you're a church that can afford this kind of thing, you want to profit maximize so you can pursue other ends. But also recognize that the church uniquely needs sanctity. Sanctity uniquely tells you that the core end that the church is trying to pursue is to advance sanctity in society. So when you have a situation like in Chile, where the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal caused 30% of the members of that church to leave, I think that that was a clear harm for the church. The church would never want to advance that end. So you need to protect sanctity. You need to avoid even the risk of a lawsuit. The only way you do that is by not doing these kinds of horrible acts. Another thing that we hear, but also we think that the large do lose sometimes because juries have an incentive to try to evaluate the truth and that kind of thing. Another thing that we hear in this round, though, is about courts need to be liberal in order to not accomplish these disproportionate harms. So in opening opposition, the problem with opening opposition's argument here is just that the deterrence argument from above, the deterrence is going to be sufficient to solve for this. And also I think that even if it's unequal, if a minority religion is causing a harm, you should probably not allow that harm to go forward. If someone is doing something like saying that you don't matter, your beliefs are unimportant, and you are someone who should not participate in our community, we think that harm is something that we should have a tort to avoid. The last thing I want to do under this question is talk about a question from closing government about the idea that just anything will be sued. So firstly, you're going to win. There's not evidence against you. Secondly, it's not going to be especially expensive when you can just have a motion to dismiss because it's a frivolous lawsuit. Thirdly, when you win, you can be awarded court costs, so it doesn't impose much of a cost. That doesn't matter in this debate. Okay, the second question in this speech has to do with how religious practices change. So the first thing that I want to do under this is give you some framing, then I'm going to respond to the direct rebuttal we got from closing opposition, and then I might take a POI, we'll see. Okay, so one thing that I want to be very clear about is that the long run is vastly more important than the short run in this debate. Opening government has some reasonable material about why maybe moderates are better off in the short run, and maybe religions are better able to fulfill some goals. But the unique analysis we give you is that religions are falling apart. People are in an increasingly secular world where technology is driving us apart from each other. We live in isolated, alienated bubbles, and religions provide a unique mechanism for people to be able to come together in a community. We think that in this context, the most important material in this debate is the ability of people to actively come together, the ability of people to actively enter into churches and engage with each other. But we also think that this directly engages with the state's obligations. Because insofar as religion is something that people tend to value, insofar as it's the case that people believe that this is important to them, the state should be promoting it, enabling them to do this. But also insofar as religion creates a community and prevents people from going into extreme kinds of harms, the state actually advances rights and prevents people from facing the kinds of harms that accrue when people are alienated, when they are in situations where they don't have any moral messaging, which convinces them to not do immoral acts like murder or harming minorities. I'm not going to take it right now, I'll take someone in a minute. Okay, so what closing opposition tells us, though, in response to the argument, is four responses. So firstly, they tell us that when we lose to the law, we're going to have the changing superiority over the system, like the bigger religions are going to win. Deterrence, that response from earlier, completely false. But secondly, I think they talk to us about how there's money and incentives to fight the law, how you get a claim to fame. Look at the Catholic sex abuse example. I think that when you lose tons of members because you seem to be a radicalized church, that's actually not in your interest. You're never going to try to pursue that. Secondly, members don't want to pay. Churches, even if they like the idea of being radical, don't want to have the people who are passing the collection plate around have to pay millions of dollars of legal fees. So even if you're likely to win, you don't want to take that chance. So the most reasonable thing to do is change your communication, change the kinds of things that you emphasize within your church. The next thing is just like people like don't want to go to hell, but like recognize that there's a difference between committing sin and the active public propagation of your most damaging beliefs. This is incredibly important material in this round because there is a difference. This round is about what you emphasize and how you communicate. It is not about saying that some religious tenet is false. I think that would be how you go to hell. That's not what we're doing. What we are saying is that churches should not say things like gay people are sinners and are bad people. You can obviously just not say that and not commit a sin at the same time. I guess I didn't have time for you. That's all right. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about here, though, just has to do with the why this analysis is so much more important than what we get from opening government. So I think firstly, we show why these changes are so beneficial, and secondly, we show how the institutions actually respond. So let's be very clear that we change the relationship that people have with their religions. We create deeper community because now you're no longer creating the kinds of political speech that drives people apart from other congregants in their congregation. We create deeper solace because there's greater focus on religious texts because people are better able to engage with the core religious ideals instead of the most marginal ideas, the ideas that are mostly directed in order to alienate minorities. And we avoid the kinds of, and we create unique moral guidance, which creates more likely people are going to do moral acts because people can get the benefits of religion. When opening opposition tells us that moderates respond better and that they don't feel like they're under attack. But firstly, insofar as there are more moderates in our church in the long run, we actually are better able to access their own benefit. But secondly, we reduce closing opposition's harm of extremism and interfaith tension because we avoid this when more people are in moderate church on their narrative. And secondly, when people are doing more moral acts, when they don't do the kinds of political speech and political harms that actually create interfaith tension. So because it is justified for the state to do this, because it creates a far better landscape for religion, we propose.
Thank you. To conclude the debate, I invite the opposition whip. Here.
Let's start off today with a brief analysis of what the front half has done before moving on to the relevant half, the back half. Starting off with OG. OG is automatically out for two reasons. First off, their deputy prime minister fundamentally misunderstands the entire opening opposition model, and they don't understand how it's different from the status quo. Which means all of their arguments are dependent on a world in which you're able to sue individuals for their actions. That world is called the world of the opposition. They're automatically out for this. The second reason that they're already out is that every single impact that they give you is dependent on the cases winning, and yet they fail to actually address all of the reasons the opening opposition gives you, and then also the more persuasive reasons the closing opposition gives you. The cases are never going to pass. Therefore, they're automatically the four. Opening opposition also has some pretty serious problems. First off, their whole analysis as to why these cases aren't going to pass, which is a critical issue in today's round that we're actually going to explain, has to do this idea with tort law and calculation. First off, we believe that closing government's POI about emotional damage with opening opposition fundamentally misunderstood was pretty accurate, which is that you can calculate damage as we do with emotional damage. So calculation is not the issue. But the second thing that we understand is that they're fundamentally missing the point because their entire standard as to why these cases aren't going to pass is because they don't fit under our modern understanding of tort law, which is completely descriptive. We can change the way the law works. That's literally what they're advocating. Which means they don't actually give you a single fundamental reason that these cases aren't going to pass. So don't worry, we're going to get that for you. The second thing that they do, which is problematic, is that the only impacts that they give you are criminalizing minority states, and the beliefs get worse, and both of these are based on the presumption that cases are going to win. Which means in the case, as they try to tell you, the cases are going to lose, they have access to zero impact. Which means even if you buy their initial claim, the rest of their case is completely irrelevant. So we're going to be the first person in today's round to actually address, first off, why these cases really aren't going to pass, and second off, why even if they don't pass, you're still going to vote for the opposition because of the massive harm from these cases being brought in the very first place. So let's talk about that. There's 3 key questions that we have to ask in today's round, but first we're going to do a little bit of outside rebuttal, starting off with some of what closing government has talked about. So first off, they gave us all these arguments about why religion is good. Yes. We believe the religions, when just trying to do their good old religious thing, can be pretty dang good. Here's what happens though. Team government turns these into a force for evil. Here's why. Because they put these in direct competition with each other. They fail to understand that the sole purpose of religions is not just to support each other, that they become like these focuses of sectarian divide. And that as my partner tells you, what's going to happen is that these court cases are going to be published in the news media 24/7. When you try to indict a pope or a priest in a predominantly religious country, that is the only thing shown on TV. This means that even if you aren't religious, you're still watching this 24/7 because this is the most important issue happening in the country. And this means that both groups have an incentive to be rioting because their very beliefs are being questioned by the state. If you think that this is going to lead, the religions are going to offer solace and guidance, then you fundamentally misunderstand the very nature of religious conflict. We agree that's what religion should do, and that's why we're on team opposition. But the second thing that they completely fail to understand is all of the arguments that my partner gives you about the reasons that churches are not, or the religious institutions are not going to change. They don't respond to the idea that institutions don't change because it is the priests that change them, not the followers. We don't care if churches are modernizing, the priests and pastors are not. It's the communities that are, and the communities do not have the influence to change them. They also don't respond to the idea that churches and institutions are not going to change because they care more about the judgment of God than what some lawyer in like an unfitting suit tells them. Therefore, there's no reason these institutions change, and we see all the negative sides of religion coming out in the world of the government. And it also has pointed out one other thing, which is that they completely ignore the argument that my partner gives you about the fundamental reasons that these cases aren't going to pass. So as we move into our first question for today's round, and that is, are these cases going to win? We see that the answer is no, and we automatically win this because they don't even address it, which is another reason you automatically drop closing government. And that's the idea that these arguments brought are going to be so vague that it just leads to more and more suits being brought, which necessarily means that you can't be resolving all of these. But the other problem we have to address is this fundamental idea of causality that opening opposition brings up but doesn't understand. And the reason that we can't address causality is this. If conservative religious organizations are going to preach conservative ideas, who is going to come join that church? People who already have conservative ideas, which means there is no way to prove that their ideas were caused by the people preaching them rather than their self-selecting, pre-identified beliefs. So there is literally no way to prove that the preachers are responsible. So there is a 0% chance that these cases are actually going to occur, which means all of these benefits are going away. But let's happen when they are actually brought, because when these cases are brought to court, and they will still be brought, there's going to be massive problems. And that's what my partner does a really good job of telling you. And that's what nobody else in this round tells you. And that's the real reason that we're going to win. Because whether or not you believe the cases are going to win, we say either way, we have a massive problem. I'll take a comment from closing. Okay. That either way, these are going to cause massive problems. First off, we have massive problems with interfaith tensions. And this is the really big idea. What do you think is going to happen when you have the state legislating what churches and other religious institutions can do? And what do you think is going to happen when, as closing government literally concedes in their last speech, it is small minority religious organizations that are predominantly going to be punished in these cases? Well, here's what's going to happen. Those are going to lead to massive riots. And these aren't just going to be religious riots because minority religious institutions predominantly represent minority races and minority ethnicities. Though we're seeing the creation of literal race riots and race wars. That's what they're defending on their side, even if these cases aren't winning, even if these cases are winning. And this is the single largest impact in the round. So what if churches are able to offer a little bit more solace when we see literal race wars being created because you're taking predominant imams and dragging them to jail on national news? That's what side government looks like. But what happens on the off chance that they win? Well, great. We have to oppress minority religions. And finally, we're just taking these people to jail for non-causal reasons. So we see no reason to vote for any other team in today's round. Thank you.